few weeks ago, just prior to the end of the year, we had a board meeting and we discussed the idea of creating a situation here where one Sabbath a month we will have what's known as a wellness Sabbath. And during that wellness Sabbath, we will have a morning presentation at this time, a fellowship meal, and then we'll have an afternoon presentation. But in light of all of the activity we had last weekend, we are going to try to do a trial run here where we just simply start with just a message, a wellness message during our worship service, not have the afternoon meal, unless, Chloe, do you have something going?
Sure, come on over if anybody wants to.
Okay, and then, but we're not going to have an afternoon meeting today. All right? So we're going to start with that. And so I pulled there's many different dimensions of wellness wheels. Mike, you had a few, didn't you, at Florida Hospital?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so we've got that's just a generic one I just threw on there just to kind of, I don't know if it's going to be a symbol we're going to stick with.
We need to pick one though.
Okay, so we'll go with that. And so this morning I would like to talk a little bit about the idea of a wellness Sabbath, and I'm going to bring in some different components. And you're going to have to pay attention to the first part because the second part is going to be a case study like I use in my classrooms where there is participation from the audience. And we do a case study. We're going to look at an individual, and we're going to look at his wellness program. Okay, and we're going to see where possibly he could have improved and maybe where we can apply that to our lives. So might want to pay attention to that. So my title this morning is, What Are You Doing Here? And I'm going to go to Romans 12 is our scripture entry into our message today on our wellness message. This is the Apostle Paul. And again, we gravitate towards authors a lot of times in the Bible that have personalities probably that you connect with. The Apostle Paul, talking here in Romans 12, 1 and 2, he says, I beseech you, or I encourage you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, that you do what? Present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. He says this is basically bare minimum. Just present your bodies, your lives to God. And then it says in verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So I'm going to start with about 1985. I first discovered when I was taking just random classes in a college setting, trying to keep my eligibility in hockey active. I had to take classes, and so I was randomly taking classes, and I ran across a couple of classes on nutrition. And it may sound kind of weird now, but at that time we didn't really know the connection between what you ate and your athletic performance. Some people did, but it wasn't widely accepted. There was no such thing as sports nutritionists of that nature. And so it was 1985, I took a class called Food for Fitness, and then I also took another class called the Selection and Preparation of Food. So I took a nutrition class, which people like to take nutrition, like to learn about biochemistry and all that, but when it comes to going to the grocery store and actually doing that, that's where a lot of my classmates said, I'm out. And I'm like, if you can't go to the grocery store and choose the foods that you just learned about, I don't like to cook. And that's a whole nother story. So what we did is I took that class together, and by the end of that quarter, I knew that was what I was going to do my career in. I knew I wasn't going to make any money playing hockey.
Hockey was gone.
I knew I wasn't going to make any money there. And I couldn't support myself or a family playing hockey, so I wisely chose to take the education route. And during that process, I then started studying with some people and started getting into some Bible studies. I was invited to a local Adventist church. And through the process there, I discovered some different things that in the Adventist church, they talked a lot about nutrition. And they talked about clean and unclean foods and those types of things. And I had no idea that the Bible actually had any health information to offer me. I thought this is all science. We got to stick to the books. We got to stick to journals, things like that. Well, so then I started thinking, okay. And then people started talking about this. And I thought basically, quote unquote, the health message was just don't eat pork. Okay, so I quit eating pork. Okay, because I saw, and then I went to the science for that and started looking at the effects of pork on the human body. Okay, so that was legitimate. It wasn't until about 2 to 3 years later, somebody loaned me a book and said, hey, you're studying nutrition. Maybe you should read this book. And it's called Counsels on Diet and Foods. And I suddenly realized that the Bible had a lot more to say about nutrition and a whole lot more about wellness. So subsequently, when I read that, I thought, well, that's interesting. I need to start a restaurant. I need to give people an outlet for a place to eat. Well, at that point, I was young and had dark hair, and just ran across some pictures this week when we got married, how dark my hair really was, and just a remnant there. Anyway, so I started looking around, and I started doing some different types of projects, and I was going to start doing some generating some funds, because I was working in a sports medicine clinic at the time, and I started generating some funds, doing some projects, saying I'm going to start doing some fundraising of my own to start a restaurant. Well, subsequently, I started doing some health seminars with a nursing professor at our local church. And we thought, well, maybe we could help people make their lifestyle changes and things like that. Well, then I met this young lady, and she was looking for something similar in mind, and she was also into cooking and baking and things like that. So we became business partners, and we started our first restaurant. And before we opened the doors, though, we realized that maybe we should take care of some personal issues and maybe get married. And so we got married and launched our first restaurant. And into that process, we learned a lot. We basically we got an MBA, a Master's in Business Administration, through opening a restaurant. We didn't have much business sense, things like that. But then we moved to the Black Hills of South Dakota, where there's this place called the Black Hills Health and Education Center. Has anybody ever heard of this place? This is where people go and live. This is a health retreat, okay? And in this health retreat, people basically unplug from their lives and go here for 18 days. And they go there, and a physician does a full exam, okay, do blood work, do different things. The nurse takes all the vital signs, exercise physiologist, dietitians, and different people work there. So it's a full medical staff that's basically based around biblical principles for life. And they go to basically a total plant-based diet, and you basically unplug from society in a way. There's still Wi-Fi there and things like that. They don't confiscate your electronics. And when you go there, and then there's an exercise facility. You can walk on trails and things like that. And so we left, we shut down our restaurant, and we heard about this place, and we ended up getting hired there. We went there for some training, and we ended up getting hired. So Chloe and I were employees at this health center, and we would see people come from literally around the world, okay? Men and women, okay? Different ethnicities, different races, and it was always amazing what would happen. What would you think would happen if a person went there and spent 18 days in a serene setting, 400 acres, a lot of terrain? You can see that the pine trees was a lot like Flagstaff. And people would come here, and we would have the opening, the physicians and the nurses would be doing the blood draws, we would be doing cooking classes, they would actually participate in making the food, and we'd sit down and enjoy the meals together. Chloe and I would do some personal training. We would take them into the fitness room and strengthen their mom. We would see people come in wheelchairs, and in less than 2 weeks be walking up and down stairs just by strengthening their muscles. 2 weeks. So I had done rotations in medical clinics, large medical centers, one in Omaha, Nebraska, liver transplant patients and things like that. And the interesting thing is when I was practicing in the medical world, in the Western medicine, I didn't see anybody get well. I didn't see anybody reverse their disease. I didn't see anybody get out of their wheelchairs. And here we would find in as little as 18 days, people reversing their diabetes. Okay? People that would actually go up and down, walking up and down stairs, okay, that had come in wheelchairs. This is 18 days. And I thought, good grief. I mean, there was people weeping, so that we'd have a graduation at the end of the 18 days, and there'd be people just weeping because their life, they'd gotten their life back. And we would pray with these people. They would get counseling and all these different things if they chose to. There was devotional times, things like that. But this was an epiphany. This was a mountaintop experience that we were able to experience for about 3 years. What do you think it'd be like to work around that environment on a day in, day out basis?
Why'd you ever leave?
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for that question, Mike. But the thing, I'll tell you why we left. The interesting thing here is my family history. I don't know what's your family history. What's your family tree look like? My family tree has a lot of heart disease and strokes, and diabetes in your family. Are your families immune to that? Do you have any of that?
Lots of heart problems.
Lots of heart problems. So my goal has always been, and I went there, and both my biological mother and biological father are both deceased right now because of cardiovascular disease. Okay? See, cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in the world today. Okay? Over 30% of the deaths that are documented, people have died with some type of actual diagnosed heart disease. Now, it's interesting that it's simple. Sometimes it just starts out slowly with high blood pressure, which is an indication of that your arteries are starting to narrow and now your heart's pumping harder to push the blood through there. Maybe you look at your cholesterol levels. Maybe you look at your waistline and you start seeing that belt no longer in those same notches, okay? All of these things go together, okay? But we're told that it's basically, that I was told that it's genetic, that I should just get ready for a bypass down the road. In fact, maybe you can pay ahead and you could actually buy a bypass in advance, or maybe your brother and you could get a 2-for-1 deal. And you can pay ahead, kind of like we do with grape plots, and you could just schedule your bypass for when you turn 60, okay? So I said, I'm not going to follow that plan, but I've been always, my goal was to try to reduce the amount of heart disease in the world. And so I got to thinking about, all those patients that went through the Black Hills, did we really make a statistical significant difference in these people? Yeah, they got emotional. Is this all emotions like David and the Psalms? Is this just an emotional roller coaster these people are on? Well, I said, okay, let's take their data. We were collecting pre and post blood draws on these people, their blood pressure, their different things like that. We took that data, and I got a really good biostatistician, and we ran the data, and we actually published it in a journal, okay? And we looked at the cardiovascular disease reduction in adults. 604 people, the average age was 58, and it's astounding the impact that this lifestyle program, and you know what the interesting thing is we actually had people reduce the amount of medication they were on, not increase. This is without medication, with the aid of doing pharmaceutical drugs. This is lifestyle, okay? Now, 58 years old, these are not old people either. That's the average age, and there's over 600 people. So it's very statistically significant, medically significant, and emotionally significant, the influence of this lifestyle on these people. So we're proving it scientifically as well. So much so that, check this out. Not long ago, I got an email, and they said, hey, we're making a documentary, and we ran across your research study, and we'd like to know if we can talk to your statistician. So I put them in touch with the statistician, and they talked to them, and then lo and behold, how many of you have seen this movie or documentary called The Game Changers? Have you seen this Game Changers? This is athletic performance on a plant-based diet. Check it out sometime. If you're interested at all in wellness and health, they actually included our research study at about the 29-minute mark on this documentary. And so we thought, wow, this is interesting. This is not just happening in some canyon, some wellness center in isolated South Dakota in the Black Hills. This is the type of impact we're having, that it's actually making an impact where this has gone around the world. Now they're going to make part 2, Game Changers part 2. This is where professional collegiate athletes, they actually track them and look at what happens when they change their lifestyle and then adopt a plant-based diet. Their performance is off the charts, gold medals, professional titles, and so forth. So here's why we left, Mike. This was exciting. But I thought, who can't get well in a lockdown laboratory situation? Okay, now these people could smuggle food in. And they could dip out in the night and go and take down a mule deer or something down in the bushes, or they could escape and go into town and get some food if they wanted. They could have. Okay. They could have. But I thought, this is an artificial environment, because we know that when the people go back home, what's probably going to happen? Probably go back. Okay, so what really needs to happen is there needs to be a support program to follow that up. But I thought, what would happen if we left this confines of this controlled environment, and I went and taught at a college, and I help teach the next generation of health professionals so that when they come out, they see this type of impact on people, and they want to practice differently than following the Western medicine model where we basically suppress symptoms. Where basically we basically go from cause to effect. So that's what happened, Mike. We packed up and moved about 100 miles south into Nebraska. And I started teaching at this college called Chadron State College. And I wanted to start educating the next generation of health professionals. Well, while we were there, I thought, what's the interesting thing is I started teaching an intro to nutrition class. Free living, they're not locked up, they're not lab animals, okay? They are free living college students. Now think of what was your diet like if you went to college? Who went to college here? Okay? What kind of food did you eat during college days? Or how about, did anybody here ever been a young adult here? When you were a young adult, what was your eating habits like?
Pizza.
Pizza? Okay? So basically, I started teaching a class called Intro to Nutrition. Okay? And I'd have about 40 students in a classroom, and we would go through, and I didn't prescribe to them, I didn't tell them what to eat, what not to eat. I just said, basically, here's what the textbook says, this is what's going on, these are what the research study says. And you know what we did? At the beginning of the semester, we did a blood draw on them. And at the end of the semester, we did a blood draw on them. We checked their body mass index, we checked their blood pressure, we did all these measures on them, and they're just living on their own. So 15 weeks instead of 18 days, right? And living on their own, we took the data and we published the data that they had a significant cardiovascular disease risk reduction in college students. There were 78 of them, average age was 23, and they significantly dropped their blood pressure, their body fat, and their cholesterol. So their cardiovascular disease risk basically went way down at that age. Now, do you expect students at that age would be at an increased risk? We're finding that earlier and earlier and earlier, people are at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. This is college students. I'm not prescribing what they eat. They're going to the cafeteria, they're going to the grocery stores, free living. And I thought, wow, we're taking the principles in isolation and bringing them out and training these young adults in lifestyle principles. And think about that. If you got a hold of your cardiovascular disease risk at 20 years old, what's it going to be when you're 60, 78? You're going to have a lot more productive life and so forth. And so I got pretty excited about that in different things. But then I thought we got to go to a bigger area. And that's when we moved again. That's when we came to Flagstaff. Okay? So we moved to Flagstaff in 2011. And immediately when we got here, we started looking around saying, what can we do to help this community? Not only my students, but the community. So I started thinking about where I work, my coworkers. I started looking at my coworkers, their health. And so what I set out to do is I set out to do an employee wellness program. So we did a 6-week wellness program in about 2015, and we followed that up with a 12-week where we didn't only do the hospital NAU employees, but we added the hospital employees, and the hospital invited us to go into their largest auditorium to do an intervention at the hospital. How does that sound? We're actually coming in and actually educating hospital employees on lifestyle. There's kind of something, I think, kind of wrong with that picture. But I thought, what a great opportunity. And so we've done 5 now. We did 5 interventions, and it's interesting that when you do things that actually go to the root cause of situations, people get excited and want to help you out. Look at this. These are our sponsors. We got Blue Cross Blue Shield to sponsor our projects. Okay? Employee Assistance and Wellness. Whole Foods Market gave us all kinds of food to give to our participants. Beans and nuts and seeds and bags full of food were given to us. Sprouts gave us food to give to our participants. And so we had not only NAU employees, but we had Northern Arizona Healthcare, which not only did we have FMC employees, we had Verde Valley Medical Center joining in through satellite beaming. So we basically did this, and what do you think would be okay, now we're talking about free living. These are truly free-range people. People living free range, okay? They're living on their own, we're not locking them up. We're not telling them, whatever. We're telling them these are the principles that you need to follow. It's basically a whole food, plant-based diet. We didn't really talk that much about mental health. We didn't talk about exercise much. We just basically said change your dietary habits, try to get more fiber in and things like that, and this is the outcome. We published a study. Again, my goal has always been to reduce cardiovascular disease because that's the number one cause of death. If we can go and reduce the amount of deaths attributed to cardiovascular disease, we make a huge impact. So we did it in isolation, we've done it with college students, and now we're doing it with free-range employees living on their own. Is that pretty cool? And basically, we're not holding anybody at gunpoint. We're not forcing them. We're not doing any guilt trips. We're not even weighing people. People want to get weighed every week because they want to be on a diet. We refuse to do that. Okay? We said, no, it's about behaviors. Did you know that basically the scale is not, it's basically an outcome measure. It's not a behavior measure. You step on the scale, it's not telling you anything about your behavior. Okay? It's a measure. Okay? So we were more interested in a behavior change. And so look at this. We've had, at that point, we had 163 total people. The average age, look at this, average age of NAU and Northern Arizona Healthcare employees, the average age is 47. Now, who do you think actually it shows up for health programs and seminars? Predominantly. Females. They're the caregivers, okay? My next one is going to be for men only. Because who has a higher risk of heart disease, diabetes? Men, okay? Tell a little bit later in life. So I started looking at this. So here's the breakdown. This is basically a composite picture of flight staff. But go over here now. We would do, before we started and at the end, look at the change that took place in these people. So basically we had an 8% drop in body weight. We've measured them once at the beginning and once at the end. No measuring in between. Okay? Waist measurements came down, hip measurements. Look at the blood pressure. Went from 129 to 123 over 77. Okay? They basically went from hypertension to less than hypertension. Total cholesterol, 11% drop. LDL, 17%. Quality of life. Now we're talking just changing your dietary habits. I'm a dietitian, I'm a nutritionist, so that's why I always focus on the food part because it's the most powerful lifestyle indicator you have, okay? So basically cholesterol came down, triglycerides, but look at the quality of life. That at 18%, right now, if you said my life could be improved, my quality of my life would go about 18% in 6 weeks, you'd say, well, which, do I have to go to my pharmacist to get that drug? And then look at this, sleep index. Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, PSQI, 20. What would happen right now if you get a 24% improvement in your sleep quality? Would that be a good thing?
Yeah.
Okay. What about your depressive symptoms? PHQ-9 is a patient health questionnaire, 9 questions where they screen people for depressive symptoms. We had a 69% improvement in depression and reduction of depressive symptoms. If you saw all this, you'd say, okay, now I got to do a commercial for some pharmaceutical agent. Right? Where do you see this stuff happening? Have you ever seen this happen before? These are just free living people, and then subsequently we published all this in research journals. This is quality stuff. So we took the principles that we did in isolation, okay, that are strongly rooted in Scripture, okay, and we followed that, and we went in here, and then we also, to be honest with you, I kind of got bored. Because I know what's going to happen to your blood pressure. I know what's going to happen to your cholesterol, and I know what's going to happen to your mood if you follow this plan. Okay? So I started thinking, okay, we got to go deeper on this because we're missing some elements. This is basically dealing with just the shell of the person, basically the physiological point. So then, during COVID, we were all set up, right before COVID hit, we were planning to do one more intervention in person with about 50 people. I had 2 graduate students and my wife, and we were going to do this, and we recruited some young, undergraduate students, and when COVID hit, they said, well, you can't meet in person, so you know what we did? We pivoted. Remember the pivot word? We were pivoting during COVID. So we pivoted from doing it in person to setting up in our house. We set up a studio every Sunday afternoon. So the clients, the patients would come in, the participants would come in and get their blood drawn with their masks on. Had college students doing the blood draws. Nursing students would do blood draws. We would put them on the body composition machines. We'd collect all their data. And we started measuring quality of life. We started measuring other things. We started looking more. We started looking deeper past the physiological. We continued to look at their depressive symptoms. We looked at generalized anxiety disorder. We looked at sleep patterns. We looked at social relationships. We looked at the satisfaction of life summary. We looked at perceived stress. And we looked at the healthy eating index. We did it for 8 weeks. 8 Sundays in a row. We would do cooking classes from our house and move them out through Zoom. We'd interact. We did a Zoom intervention from our kitchen. Hired a kid from the communications department. He came out with his camera. He set it all up. We had the nursing students doing the blood draws. We had this team of about 20 people doing this. And so what did we do at the end? We basically published it all, and we found that basically dramatic reduction in depression. Okay, we saw a dramatic reduction in generalized anxiety. We saw an improvement in sleep. We saw that the satisfaction of life went through the roof. And we saw that the perceived stress was dramatically reduced, all in 8 weeks, 2 months. That's what we saw during COVID. And we thought, well, that's amazing. But I still wasn't satisfied, okay? So I started looking at this because are we not multidimensional human beings? Yeah, we can cleanse and nourish our bodies and eat a great diet. Make sure we're getting fluids in, and maybe you're doing your cold plunge. Anybody doing cold plunges now? Okay. Oh, we got a whole group doing cold plunges. All right.
Yeah, showers.
Hot and cold showers.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can do that. But I'm interested now. I know what we can do here. We already know what we can do here. I mean, I'm not the only person. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm the only person doing this. There's hundreds of people out there. In fact, I'm a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. People are doing this all over the world. Okay? But what about down here? This is where the rest of my career, this is where I'm going. How do we, in a sense, get to the point where we can actually get to the brain and the mind and awaken the spirit? So that's the rest of this. And we're going to do a case study now, because I want to share with you somebody who was following a plant-based diet, who was very active, okay, and a very spiritual person. He's a perfect case study to see if this applies to maybe the missing link in any of our lives. But before we go there, I want you to look at the idea that we had a 70% improvement, okay? So that's a reduction in depressive symptoms in as little as 6 weeks. We did it in the 9 weeks, we did it in the 12 weeks, we saw it in the 8 weeks, routinely. But that is dealing with the brain. We can get the brain nourished, okay? That's the hardware. And I'm suddenly realizing that the brain has basically a couple of different major functions. One is the hardware of the brain. That's the nutrients we give it, the fluids we give it, and all those type of things. But then what about the mind? The mind is the software, okay, that runs the body. And I want to kind of shift gears because I made a discovery in the last couple of weeks about this. And yeah, we're really good at getting omega-3 fatty acids, changing the microbiome, maybe doing the hot and cold contrast showers where you increase your circulation and you get this dopamine high, okay, and you get an improved mood. But what about the gears, the thinking in the mind? Does anybody have any kind of thought patterns that they'd like to maybe change? Okay, that you're maybe get into those ruts. Okay, I understand that when you go on the Alaskan highway, they say pick your rut carefully. You're going to be in it for the next 800 miles, right? When you're going on the Alaskan highway, so you got to. How many are you stuck in a rut, maybe in your thought processes? And again, the best presentation is when the presenter is actually experiencing those same things. So I want to take you to an interesting scenario. I want to take you to the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. Okay, in 1 Kings, who do you think this is? A picture or a drawing of? Who do you think this guy getting fed by ravens out in the wilderness? Elijah. So let's turn to 1 Kings, okay? And we're going to look at a mental health mind process that maybe we can identify where maybe we can do some improvement. And in fact, I'd like to do another study coming up where we actually address these in conjunction with the improvements of the body. So let's look at a case study. I want you to join in here now. This guy is known as Elijah. Elijah the Tishbite. Okay? What do we know? What do you already know about Elijah the Tishbite before we even get to 1 Kings 17? What do you know? You guys, some of you shot out, you knew by the picture that it might be him. What do we know about him? Who is this guy? Where did he grow up? What's his genetic and background, his family background? We know he's a Tishbite. What do we know about Tishbites? Anything? I don't know much about Tishbites. We have no idea who his parents were. We don't know what his cardiovascular disease risk is. We don't know what his tendency to depression is. We have no idea. We have no background. We have no medical history on this guy. Right? What do we know about him? What do you know about Elijah already?
He's a prophet.
He's a prophet. So what is he? Let's right out of the chute. What is a prophet? He's a spokesman? What was it? Spiritual person. And you know what? You know what I just found out last night? Think about Elijah. You know how important he is to Judaism? He's in the Old Testament. He's a prophet. He's mentioned in the New Testament. And I thought that was pretty good, but I didn't know this. But you know what? Even the Quran, I've never read the Quran, but in the Quran, they mention Elijah being on Mount Carmel. He's a very pronounced person in the spiritual kingdoms here. But specifically, he's an Old Testament prophet. So he's a spokesman that God chose him. He didn't run for office and get elected. Right? He was chosen by God. He says, I want you to be my spokesman for Israel. Okay, so there's a spiritual dimension there. Go to chapter 17. Let's just get the high points. And he comes in out of the nowhere. And what's going on? What's the environment that he's brought in to do? What is his main job? Elijah's. Reform? Okay. So is there going to be some parallels between Elijah and our day? What was going on that he had to quote-unquote reform? Anybody? What was going on that Elijah was going to be raised up as a prophet to speak for God? Any idea? Dr. Moses, what do you got?
Well, he was against the false prophets.
Okay. So there was some stuff going on. There was some false stuff going on, and he was supposed to accentuate and raise up the positive stuff. So he goes directly to the king.
Right.
This is how bold he is. Is he confident? Is this a bold person that comes in and he goes to the president of the country or whatever? He goes to the king and says, hey, king. What does he say? We've got to change some things here. And then what does he do? Where does he go from there? The Lord takes him to that picture right there, and he takes him out into the wilderness, and he just drops off like Cheetos and Oreo cookies and Mountain Dew. Dropped him off out there. That's what the ravens were bringing him, right? They're bringing him Whole Foods, right? Then he comes out and he brings him pure water. And so is this guy basically living the lifestyle? A good, clean lifestyle. Is he confident? Is he spiritual?
Yes.
Okay? Okay, so those are the characteristics. And then what happens here? And he's drinking pure water from the brook, right? And he's getting food from the ravens. And what happens then? What happens to the brook back there? It dries up. And so what does he do? He leaves there and he goes and he starts looking for food, right? He's a hunter or a gatherer. He's a gatherer. So he goes and he runs into, and I'm still in chapter 17, and he goes and he finds a widow and a son. And what's happened there? What's the situation with the widow and the son?
Ready to die?
What's that?
Preparing their last meal.
They're in famine too, aren't they? And what does he ask? He says, make a cake for me, and then make one for yourself. And then she does that, and everything's fine. But then what happens to the son? The son dies. And what does Elijah, the spiritual person he is, what does he do? He resurrects him. Here's the first incident of a resurrection in Scripture. Elijah basically raises this widow's son from the dead and restores him. Okay? So What are you thinking about Elijah right now? If you were a kid back then, kind of like we did with Michael Jordan and Wayne Gretzky, we had posters on the wall of these guys. Remember those athletes? Did you guys have that? Am I the only guy? Did you guys have posters on your walls of rock stars and athletes and stuff? Who'd you have? Jim?
Like the new kids on the block.
New Kids on the Block. Okay, if you were a kid back there, you'd probably have Elijah's poster on the wall. If you had a wall and there was posters. Right? Is this guy the dude? Mike? He's the real deal, isn't he?
Probably Ahab would be on it.
Oh, Ahab, because he's on the money too. Okay. So then, so that's what's going on. Positive things. How's Elijah's mood at this point? Does he need a depression recovery program? Do you think? Is he mountaintopping it? He's probably living it, right? What do you got, Chloe?
He's probably incognito because he doesn't want his life to be taken.
But how is he doing personally at home? Is he hitting it on all cylinders?
Seems to be. He doesn't really tell us, but yeah.
But he's probably the dude, right? I would think. Am I weird? Or what? I mean, I just think this guy's rocking it.
Well, I think in hindsight that we can think he's the dude. But
Okay.
I mean, wasn't he out there to begin with because he feared for his life?
Okay, so he was told to go into hiding,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, but he's still performing miracles, right? So is he connected to the Lord?
Yeah.
He's a spiritual guy. Look at chapter 18 now. What happens here? Now he says, hey, it's time for, the Lord tells him, it's time to go to talk to Ahab and tell Ahab it's time to have a showdown. And he basically walks into the king's palace. He's been out in hiding. And he walks in and he says, oh, by the way, he says in verse 8 of 1 Kings 18, Elijah's here. I'm here. So whatever you take from that, and then basically he says, we need to settle this. We need to clear out these prophets of Baal. And they do this whole thing where they're going to do a showdown on Mount Carmel. You guys have ever read that story? Where the prophets of Baal come and Elijah comes. What's the odds on that battle? How many prophets of Baal are there?
450.
450 to what? One God. One guy with God, right? So you, with God, is a majority. You ever thought about that? You got 450, you got the David complex, where you got enemies breathing down your back. You plus God is a majority.
Hallelujah.
What do you think of that? And he basically goes up on Mount Carmel, and it came past the evening sacrifice. And so we know that story, right? Do you know that story well enough? That they had this showdown, and they basically, the prophets of Baal, they cut up their sacrifice, and they put it out there, and nothing happens. So what does Elijah do? What does he do to those prophets of Baal when they start cutting themselves? They're trying to get their sacrifice to get lit up and to burn up and things like that. What are they doing? What does he say to them?
Your God must be sleeping.
Hey, a little louder. Wake up. What do you think is going through Elijah's mind and his body when he's standing there on Carmel and he's in center of God's will and he's doing what God told him to do? Do you think he's like at the veins sticking out of his arms, like maybe the Terminator type of thing? I mean, he's up there. This is it. This is a spiritual, basically, smackdown. And what do you think? Do you think he's right at the center of God's will? He's up there, and what happens? Nothing happens. And then what happens when they put his sacrifice on there? What does he tell them to do? Put more water on it. Just to prove that God can do this. And God came down and basically burned up the offering. So, what do you think? Now, give me some feedback. Elijah's done this. Did he sit there and worry and wring his hands and get all nervous and stuff like that? Or did he just follow God's plan? He's following God's plan. Spiritual person. And it all basically turns out great. Would this is maybe where we got the saying a mountaintop experience. Did Elijah have that? He had that, didn't he? Now, what happens when we shift gears and the drought ends and it starts raining? They have monsoon season. They had monsoon season on the top of Mount Carmel and it starts raining. And God instructs Elijah to lead King Ahab off the mountain. Take him off the mountain, right? And Ahab told Jezebel all that had gone on. Now, what about this evil woman? What part is she playing? The king's wife, the queen. Puts a bounty on Elijah's head, doesn't he? And they come down, and what happens? What happens here? So let's pick it up in chapter 19 of 1 Kings. And then what happens? He comes down the mountain in verse 1, and then basically in verse 2, Elijah is a messenger, and he says, let the gods do to me, and blah, 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 and he goes down, and look at verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. So basically, Elijah drops off King Ahab, and he keeps going. What flipped there in Elijah's head? This is the case study. Now, I want you to diagnose with me what went on here, because I think some of us fall into this same trap. Some of the people that have been in our research studies, they fall into this as well. Okay? So what do we got here? We got Elijah's the prophet. He's a miracle worker. Okay? He lived in the northern kingdom of Israel. He defended the worship of the Hebrew God over that of the Canaanite deity. Positive things. Mountaintop experience. Victory, victory, victory. And then what happens here? He resurrected some people. He brought fire down from heaven. But we have going on right here now, he takes off and he starts running to the desert. Look at verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed what? What's it say there? I can't read that correctly. What's verse 4 say in your Bible?
Requested that he might die.
Okay? And said, it is not enough now, Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my father's. What happened between Carmel and now?
Sleep deprivation.
Sleep deprivation.
He was very busy all day making sure that the priests didn't try to light the sacrifice on fire. He ran in front of the chariot. He laid down to sleep, and he gets this threat from Jezebel. He's sleep deprived.
Okay, anybody else? Case study. We're looking at what could possibly have triggered this depressive symptom to the point he's suicidal.
He's fearful.
Fearful of who or what?
Jezebel.
Okay, here's a guy who just hours before this was on the mountaintop of his life. And now he's bottom. He's rock bottom. In a matter of just a few hours. Does this sound like your life? Had some, I think back on some of the most exciting aspects of my life have been up here, and then what do you just plan for it now that when you have that super high, when you go have that dopamine rush where you actually do the cold plunge, you know that you can't maintain that buzz all day long, right? So what's going on here? So now we see him running actually to the point of suicide. He's suicidal. He's asking God to take him out. Then as he lay and slept, Chloe, you said he is sleep deprived.
Yeah.
Okay? Actually, for my dissertation, I actually studied sleep, and they actually took people. There was a professor from Stanford who would take his research subjects, Mike, in his convertible car, and he would drive around with them to keep them awake for 36 hours to study the effects of sleep deprivation on people. He actually had a convertible car, and they would drive around, and he'd have the person in there and make them stay awake. Okay? Sleep deprivation. Did you know that actually people sleep deprived actually have the same reactionary time in responses as someone who is actually legally drunk? Sleep deprivation. So Chloe, something there with sleep deprivation. Fear gets you to do weird things. And then it says he laid and slept under a broom tree, and suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. He probably hadn't eaten for about 24 hours either, could he? Probably. So now he's got angels feeding him angel food coming to him. So think about this. Here's a spiritual guy who has a bad day. Right? Have you ever had a bad day? Does God abandon you when you have a bad day? He sends an angel to go and minister to the depressed, suicidal prophet. Does that give you comfort that, in a sense, you may have a bad day? You may get to the point where you think that your life is meaningless. God sends people, and sometimes angels, directly to us to minister to us. How about those people that dropped off the food when you were a kid? Remember those bags of grocery? We got angels. We have different things. We've got the ravens dropping the food off, and he's doing these things, and he's telling them to eat, get up and eat. And then what happens in verse 9? And there Elijah went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And what does Elijah say? "I've been very zealous for the Lord, God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." So it's just interesting, when I was looking at this, Elijah is on a mountaintop one day, he's in the cave the next day. And it suddenly dawned on me, this is the first man cave. And what is really popular right now? To have a man cave to retreat to. How many men are retreating to their man cave and getting in there and participating in all kinds of interesting activities in their man cave? Right? But does God leave Elijah in the man cave? What's he do? He calls him out of there. He says, go out and stand and so forth, and he comes by and he has a mighty wind and he has fire and an earthquake. And look at verse 13. So it was when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in the mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of his man cave. And suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah repeats it. This is the second time. "I've been very zealous for the Lord, God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." So, analyze that for me. Case study. What happened to the Elijah that was raising people from the dead, calling out Ahab, and then basically calling out the prophets of Baal less than 24 hours before this, and then he went to the cave, and then all these things, maybe it's 40 days later. He's still in a depressive state 40 days later. What changed in his thinking? And I think if we can understand this is the key to deeper wellness. What do you think happened there? What's the language? What do you see in verse 10 and verse 14? What word is in there a lot? It's a one-letter word. It's a one-letter word in verse 10 and 14. I. Where did the focus from Elijah go?
From God yourself.
Went from God to self. How did that happen in a matter of just a short period of time?
Well, there was a couple degrees of exhaustion.
Okay,
One was sleep
so we had sleep and food.
and food.
Okay.
You know, both of those, he is now taxed, to the point that he's now only working on mental power.
Yes,
So he's burnt that out, apparently.
but now he's gone 40 days, Mike, and he's getting fed, and he's getting plenty of sleep in the cave, right? So you'd think that maybe he'd be nourished enough and be caught up on his sleep. What's going on? What's going on in his mental processes?
Well, he traveled for 40 days to
Okay.
get to Hebron.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's not like you and I hopping in the car and you're going to drive down to Phoenix, and then the next day we drive to LA, and the next day we drive, somewhere else. I mean, he's walking, on foot.
Okay,
So, yeah, he may be getting sleep, but he's still...
he's
my
taxed.
goodness. Yeah, I mean, he's
He's
exhausted all his reserves.
okay.
Yeah.
His body fat is now fairly low.
My goodness, he's lean.
Okay. Anybody else? What else do we have?
Plenty of exercise, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's once again, his focus is on himself.
Okay, but
Running
somehow
because of himself.
the physical body, though, the tax to the physical body is affecting him mentally. Did you have something?
Just that he has said a couple times that he's alone.
He feels alone. He feels separated. When you look at what he's saying here, are these factual, accurate statements?
I think what happened when he got when he was going through his physical turmoil and his mental turmoil, he got disconnected from God.
Okay,
And that's why he felt he was alone, because he was no longer connected to God. He didn't feel like he was as strong as he actually was.
okay.
And maybe, when we're in that state, it's more of a way for Satan to tempt you, to get into your mind.
Think about that. How do predators, when they come upon a come upon a herd of deer or elk or whatever. You've seen all these videos.
Go for the weak
What
one.
they always do, they always try to get one away from the pack, don't they? And they try to feed on that one, the weaker, smaller ones. But they always try to separate the one person from the rest of the group. So what do we do typically when we're feeling like this? Do we show up for Sabbath school? Do we show up for church?
Yeah,
Some people
we
do.
should.
Okay? But typically, where are the rest of the people today that are having a challenge? Okay? We need to come up next to those people and encourage them. Okay? But I want to share with you, and I want you to look at this, and I want you to pinpoint if Elijah had any of this going on. Okay? Just by what we're seeing here. Don't have to read between the lines. Don't have to look at anything. I want to look at some of the mental health software factors, the way we process things, the way we look at things. They're called cognitive distortions. These are common. Okay, so let's look at when Elijah was running from Jezebel and he was going to his man cave, was he experiencing any all or nothing thinking, upper left? Was it all or nothing?
I'm the only one left, he said.
I'm the only one left. Did he notice any of his failures? And did he look at his successes while saying, you know, this isn't so bad. I raised a guy from the dead. I helped a widow out. I took care of the prophets of Baal. Did he reflect on the positive things he did? Or was he just looking at his failures, supposed failures? Yes or no? What do you think? Okay? Was he jumping to conclusions? Did Elijah jump to conclusions?
Yes, I'm the only one left.
I'm the only one left. What about emotional reasoning? Was he embarrassed? Was he assuming that because we feel a certain way that maybe things must not be true? Was he letting his emotions control him?
Very emotional.
Now, I'm not minimizing the fact that he was running on low reserves, probably dehydrated to a certain extent. Okay? I'm a loser. I'm completely useless. Was he labeling himself as being stupid and worthless? How about up here? Did he overgeneralize? Everything's always awful. I'm no good. I'm no better than my fathers. Did he disqualify the positive things he had done?
He didn't even acknowledge the positive things he had done.
Was he magnification? Was he catastrophic and minimizing? Was he magnifying, blowing things out of proportion?
I'm the only one.
Okay? Did he use critical words? Should, must, ought to, things like that? Probably not so much there. And then you go down here. So when you look at the cognitive distortions, the common 10 cognitive distortions, how many of these was Elijah actually going through? Was he actually rehearsing in his head? This is what's going on in his head. This is what he's thinking. What do you think here? Which ones? At least 5?
75%.
75% of them. Elijah had switched over from being confident in God, that he was looking at himself, and he had, in a sense, gone into this cognitive distorted mindset. Did you know that most of us do this as well? You could be doing all the omega-3 fatty acids, you could be eating your walnuts, doing your cold plunge, okay, doing your exercise, getting your 30 minutes of aerobic activity in a day, eating a totally plant-based diet, and that positions you to have a healthy brain. But what's going on in mental processing in here? And some of this stuff starts in childhood. I'm stupid. We label ourselves. I'm no good. It's all or nothing. All these different things. What do you think here? Case study.
You know, his focus pre this event, he must have had a very strong focus on God. Jezebel has an interesting impact, or flips a switch in him when she, puts out the edict, kill, that somehow causes him to lose that connection or that focus and drop into this kind of thinking.
Okay?
In terms of situation. Women, yeah.
The woman.
But we have a lot of impact on what they think.
I see that what other perceptions, the people that are outside of you, what their perception of you has an effect on your own mind.
What you perceive, how they look at you, is a distortion.
But Jezebel clearly said, you're going to be like one of the prophets of Baal tomorrow.
Here's a guy that just took down 450 prophets, though. And one woman's going to attempt that? You're going to blame it all on the woman?
It only takes one negative thought to totally.
And there's a cascade, didn't it?
Yeah.
Look at where he ends up. He ends up hiding in a cave. This is a man of God, okay? And he's got angels ministering to him. So it's not like God leaves us in the cave. He says, come out of the cave. Why are you in the cave, Elijah? So this is God's treatment plan, which is known as, a lot of times referred to as rational emotive spiritual therapy. It's a fancy way of saying reality therapy. Another term for, I just found out about this. Another more common term for this is cognitive behavioral therapy, where you basically replace those distorted thoughts with true things. Look at what God does in 1 Kings chapter 19. The Lord says to him in verse 15, what does the Lord say to him? Hey, just hang out. You're tired. We'll feed you here. Just hang out in the cave. No big deal. Well, you need a wellness day. You need to take a day off. What does he say to him? Go.
Go back.
Go back.
Get to work.
Get to work. Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael. Also, he gives him something to do to get outside of himself. Get back to what I called you to do. Get out of the cave. Get back to work. What I've called you to. Find out that's why it's important to know what God's calling you to do, because then you can go back to it if you get off track. And he says, do all this stuff. And then in verse 17, it says, it shall be that whoever escapes the sword and so forth. And then what does he say right here? What does God say? He uses reality. He replaces distorted thinking with factual information. Look at this. What does God say? I've reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed them. I still have 7,000 people. You're not alone, Elijah. He comforts him. He secures him. And he says basically, he uses this basically what they're calling this rational emotive spiritual therapy with fancy names for basically saying reality. Let's talk you through this. Let's get you back on track. Let's keep working. And let's basically go back to what you were doing. And basically, he basically says, why are you here? Okay. Jesus used this also, when you start looking at it, Jesus used it on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. We're not going to go there, but that's another example where Jesus was walking with these two disciples who had cognitive distortion. They said, oh, basically this whole idea, but where did it come from? Because what the deal was is disappointment ends with an appointment with God. God ministers to us. He shows up, and basically our disappointment, just like Elijah's disappointment is that he expected X, Y, and Z to happen. It didn't happen. He got disappointed, and he started going through all this cognitive distorted things. The road to Emmaus. Remember these two guys were leaving Jerusalem? And they're walking, and Jesus joins them. The resurrected Jesus finds them on the road, and they start saying, hey, what are you doing? And Jesus says, what are you guys talking about? And they said, you idiot, don't you know about this resurrection thing? They said, we were planning on being part of this big movement and stuff like that. They had disappointment. But they had distorted in their mind their expectations. And Jesus restored them by how? By going to the scriptures and saying he started where? With Moses and the prophet, and he started sharing with them that no, Jesus didn't come here as a conquering king. He came here as a sacrifice. And it says basically at the end of that, they said basically, didn't our hearts burn within us? So Jesus uses this cognitive realignment to get us out of our dysfunctional and distorted way of thinking. And any other thoughts? But we're going to wrap it up now. So cognitive distortions. Do you have a tendency to go all or nothing, black and white thinking? It's all this or all that? Okay? How about your mental filter? You look at your failures more than your successes. I remember being part of a psychology study, Mike, and they took us, it's intro to psychology class in college, and they put us in this room and they said, oh, just sit in this room for a few minutes. Oh, and these cards right here on the table, the front cards are the answers you got right on your last test. We haven't got the results yet. And in the back are the ones you got wrong. Where would you go in that deck? And they monitored us to see if we were more looking at the ones we got right or the ones we got wrong. Look at this. How many times do you look at all these little incidental things that you did wrong? You look at your failures and don't even minimize your successes. That's a cognitive distortion. The next one, jumping to conclusion. Oh, that person did this, so that means that. Said one thing and we get all distorted. Emotional reasoning, we label things. I'm such a loser. I'm so stupid. My parents always said I wouldn't amount to anything, and we repeat that. When we repeat these things, the cognitive distortion, no matter how healthy the shell of our body is, this is going to mess up the trajectory of our lives, our spiritual life, and our physical life. Okay? Overgeneralizing. Disqualifying the positive things. I just want you to be aware, and that's the message today, to add to your wellness plan, that you basically replace these distortions with factual things, and that you actually go to Scripture and have God tell you who truly you are and who you are in His eyes. In closing, from Prophets and Kings, to every child of God whose voice the enemy of souls has succeeded in silencing, the question is addressed, what doest thou here? I commissioned you to go into all the world and preach the gospel, to prepare a people for the day of God. Why are you here, and who sent you? Let's not let the enemy of our souls get in the way of us and our callings. Let's do away. Let's deal with our cognitive distortions. Let's be aware of them, okay? And allow God to replace those with positive, restorative thinking for our total, true wellness plan. What do you say? All right. Mike, we're going to do the closing song.